Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Richard Sinapi. I'm here today on behalf of the New England Mechanical Contractors Association. It's a trade association of major contractors in the mechanical trades. If you see a big building or a big power plant or water works, one of our members probably built it. I'm here today because, yes, we'd like to see jobs. We'd like to put our company to work and put members of the plumbers and pipe fitters to work. This plant would bring in $350 million in wages and benefits paid to workers in this state. It would bring in approximately $150 million in income taxes. And as far as payments in lieu of taxes, perhaps $150 to $200 million over the life of the plant. But that's not why we're here today. We're not here today to support this power plant or not, because that's not before you. We're here today to oppose this bill because there's an existing procedure in place, democratically established. And if I may say, it was established with a degree of intelligence, thoughtfulness, and based on past practice, the best practices in making decisions of this type. We have the Energy Facilities Citing Board. It's a board of experts that relies on experts. It relies on and obtains information and recommendations from numerous public agencies and bodies. It takes testimony from the public. It uses recommendations of experts. It uses data, and it makes a determination. And it weighs not just the local interest of 18,000 people or 600 people. It weighs the best interests not only of the state of Rhode Island, but it weighs the interests of the entire region. Is this power plant needed? Is it properly cited? And all the things that Jerry Elmer said, and all his expertise and all that information, they take that into account when they make their determination. And that's the process that's been established. Similarly, when we're talking about a tax treaty, we have a process in place. General Assembly approves the authority to have a tax treaty. The local town council negotiates one, and the local town council approves it. And let me tell you a little something about that process. It works, and it's there for a reason, and that is because 18,000 people do not have the time, knowledge, training, or expertise to negotiate a tax treaty or to determine what is a good number. Let me tell you how I know that, because I've negotiated these tax treaties, and you can't Google it. There's no way to Google it. I had to spend hours and hours to determine how I would go about negotiating this tax treaty for my client. And it's a very complex, difficult thing to do to try to value what that is. And then you have to figure out what is the minimum we will take and why. And then you have to understand what is their alternative. What will they do if we go above this number? And you negotiate and you try to find out what that number is. What is the breaking point? It's a very complex, not only that, but it requires, like most legislation, it requires the gathering of information, the collegial give and take, and a thoughtful, dispassionate decision. And that is not something 18,000 people can do. And if they approve a tax treaty of X million dollars and that came to the voters, how would they have any ability to assess whether that's a good deal or not? The process is far, far more complex than that. I feel the pain of the people who testified here today because I live in Warwick. And I feel their pain every time I hear the airplane go over my house, and when I try to take my son to practice at Mickey Stevens and I got to go through all the construction. I feel their pain. 90,000 people in Warwick were not granted a veto power over that project. And let me tell you something, this is a veto power. You kill a tax treaty, there will be no power plant. It cannot be done. The economics do not work. It totally skews the tax base. You can't do it. But we weren't given a veto power. You know why? Because there's a process in place. There was a process in place to to determine whether that made sense, balancing the interests of the local people and the state. And that determination was made. And I can't cry too much about it because I chose to live in Warwick. And guess what? There's a big airport in Warwick. I chose to live there. So I understand that that is part of the deal. Unfortunately, the residents who are concerned, they chose to live in a part of the state where there is the largest natural gas pipeline that goes through the corner of our state. And that's a fact. And we can't move that to Warwick and put a power plant in Warwick. It's either going to be in Burrillville or it's going to be in Massachusetts. I don't know where it should be. I'm not advocating for that. I'm going to let the Energy Facility Siting Board make that decision. But that's not even the worst part of this legislation. And I want to say this first. Cale Keeble and Senator Fogarty, I know they have the best interests of their constituents in mind in doing this, and they believe they're doing what they're elected to do on behalf of their constituents. But I must say, with all due respect, this is the single worst piece of legislation, anti-economic legislation, that I've ever seen come out of the General Assembly or even be discussed in the General Assembly. It attempts to, after the fact, change the deal, to change the process to make a major economic investment, a once-in-a-decade economic development, more difficult because it has adverse impacts. There is no $700 million project that you're going to construct in the state for jobs, for economic benefit, that's not going to have some adverse economic impacts. You can put a sign and say outside on 95, in and out, and at the airport, closed for business if you pass this legislation. I have been secretly for about a year trying to lure to the state of Rhode Island a possible $1 billion investment that would be a game changer in the tourism industry in this state. I was very close in a very long process to getting them to sit down with the Commerce Corporation. Since this legislation has become public, they won't even return my calls. If you want to kill economic development in the state, pass this legislation which changes the deal after the facts and makes these projects more difficult, more expensive. I urge you strongly and vigorously, not just representing my client NEMCA, but on behalf of my family and all of whom live in this state and my children who would like to continue living in this state, do not pass this legislation. We have an existing process and procedure to make that determination in an intelligent, reasoned fashion. We have a tax treaty process which is very complex, and we have a town council who is able to and has been charged legally with doing that. Do not set a precedent that is going to make this state close for business. Thank you.
Any questions for the witness? Okay, thank you for your testimony. You may proceed, sir. Body, you have a question?
Just a comment. Dick, I always appreciate your passion. I agree with you 1,000%. I have to take issue with two things that you said. And I understand completely. In fact, it was almost like you were talking in a mirror when many of the things you said. But two things. One, I'm not so sure that the people of Burrillville even knew that there was this gas, the focal point for the gas there when they moved there. I think that's a little unfair. And secondly, I would have ended the thought at saying that Senator Fogarty has his constituents at heart. And I would have ended the thought there. Not that this is the single worst piece of legislation ever written. I think Senator Fogarty's working hard for his constituents.
Any other comments or questions? You may proceed. Identify yourself, sir.
Allan Shore, on behalf of Invenergy, the company proposing the project. For the record, the company opposes the legislation that's before you. I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that. I wanted to just address a couple of points and then turn it over to Mr. Beretta.
Counsel, if I could maybe ask you, since you are the attorney for, and there's been a lot of discussion, hopefully in your testimony Can you talk about the tax treaty, the negotiations that occurred, whether that's all final and whether or not...
We can give you an update on status.
Yeah, give us an update and let us know, although this is not signed and dated from the town of Burrillville, is this correct information that we have in front of us? Do you have a copy of this? Yeah, let me finish, Senator Lombardi. The question I have is, if I could have one of the, have you seen what we received from the town? I'd like you to look at that and comment on that during your testimony.
Let me take a quick look, though.
There's no signature and no date on that. So during the course of your testimony, and I'll yield to Senator Lombardi for his question, but I would like you to address that during the course of your testimony. Senator, you have a comment?
No, actually supplement. I'm not so much concerned about the accuracy of the statement contained in that piece, insofar as does it represent an actual legislative act. We've heard testimony that there's never been a public hearing on it. That's my, okay? Thank you.
I'll defer to Mr. Beretta.
Well, why don't we let Mr. Beretta comment on that? Why don't you tell us?
Mr. Chairman, this document obviously is not an Invenergy document.
I can't hear you.
This document is not an Invenergy document. This document came from the town of Burrillville. We did not participate in the drafting of this document.
No, I know you did not participate, but you did participate in the negotiations with the town council, did you not?
And they are continuing to proceed.
Okay, so so are there no final end results of that negotiation? Are you complete with your negotiations as to what the terms are of that
I would
tax?
say we are near completion.
You're near and so is that the reason why the town has not, as a group, had an opportunity to find out exactly what's going on with this treaty? Is that the reason why they're still in the dock?
Correct. I don't know about dark, but the negotiations are in their final stages.
Okay.
And it makes sense not to present an agreement until it's finalized between the parties.
Okay, and fine, and I would agree with that because I think that's the obligation of the town council and of the
And we are legal
proprietor
counsel to
here.
Invenergy.
I would imagine the council, and somebody will have to speak then at a later time as to when the council plans to bring that before the public and have a vetting on whether or not they approve it. Forget this legislation. Even if that can be accomplished, then I think that's important to the town residents. Go ahead, I'm sorry, you can proceed.
The reason I asked Mr. Shore to join me up here is Jerry Elmer raised a couple of issues. And as we know, I mean, Jerry is a friend of ours. We're on the opposite side of Jerry frequently. CLF opposes any energy project. It's their job. And Jerry does a very good job articulating the arguments. And he raised a couple of things that Allan is the head of our regulatory group. And I thought he could clarify two issues that Jerry raised that seemed to raise some questions from the committee. The first one, Senator Jabor, you raised the question regarding the Resilient Rhode Island Act.
Correct.
And I'm not sure that the issue, and then Jerry raised the issue of need. Need one is, a little more basic, obviously. Need is determined by the EFSB with input from the PUC. But ultimately, the ISO, which controls the energy system in this region, they determine when and if they need additional generation. And, to put it before this body, and I know some of you professionally probably know as much about energy consumption and energy production as I do. But the reality is I'm not qualified to determine what the ISO decides. And I think it was kind of unfair to put that forth to you. I mean, the reality is 485 megawatts were awarded in the last auction. we will participate in the next auction with the expectation that the second unit of the plant will be awarded by the ISO. But again, that's the process. And similarly, the overall need for Rhode Island will be determined as part of the EFSB licensing process. If you have any questions about that, I mean, the reality in terms of power plants, the ISO selects energy facilities or seeks new energy generation because they know that other facilities are going to be retired over time. There's already been 2 or 3 major announcements, but the reality is they're aware of more. And this plant is what's called a fast start plant. And it's what the ISO is looking for. This is the state-of-the-art in gas-fired energy. And what a fast start plant does is backstop renewables. Everybody wants more renewables. Invenergy is the second largest wind company in the United States. What these plants do, and the capability that they have, is to start at the drop of a hat. When the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, you need to replace the generation from the windmills and from the mirrors or the solar projects. And this plant is exactly part of the ISO's plan for the future.
Senator Archambault.
What do you mean by backstop renewables? Can you? I think I've got it, but is it amplifying?
Backstopping renewables is I probably didn't articulate it very well. But renewables are driven, and I'll let Allan jump in because he knows this better than I do, are driven by, and I know Senator Conway would like me to give it to the expert, but renewables obviously are driven by variables, i.e. wind, i.e. sun. And when those conditions change, that energy that's being produced by the renewables needs to be replaced. And most plants, existing plants right now, take as long as 12 hours to start producing electrons. This plant can do it in approximately an hour. So when the ISO sees conditions changing and generation slowing from renewables, this plant will be dispatched to replace that capability or that generation.
Yeah, I should just point out that, unlike other utilities like water utilities where you can store water in a reservoir or somewhere else so that when it's needed, when a customer needs that service, you have a storage of water to provide that water service. Electricity is completely different. You can't really store electricity. It has to be delivered the moment a customer turns the switch, puts the lights on, turns the air conditioner on, the like. So the power has to be available instantaneously. So to make that happen, the regional ISO that Mr. Beretta referred to is like the air control, tower. They're controlling all the power plants, all the facilities, renewables, solar, wind, natural gas, whatever. When the power is needed, if it's a hot peak summer day, air conditioners are going to be needed. If it's a really calm day and the wind is not blowing and it's cloudy, you're not going to have the availability of wind and solar resources to meet the load, the electric load that's required to keep everybody lights on, air conditioners working, etc. So in that situation, the air control tower, they're going to look and see, well, what's the next cleanest, most efficient burning operating generator in our whole New England region. And as you've heard, this project would be the cleanest, most efficient project in New England. So by the rules and the way the ISO system is set up, they will look to the next up the line. No renewable can meet it. Next up is the cleanest available and most efficient, and that will be this project. That project will then be turned on to backstop the inability of the renewable energy resource to meet the demand.
Senator Lombardi and then Senator Archambault.
Thank you. One of the questions that I thought was most poignant early, we've been focusing a lot on economics, and Senator Jabot, I think, poignantly asked the question about the young children and the young lady that testified earlier who lives across the street. astonishingly, there is nothing before us, either negatively or positively, about any environmental effects that this may have. I did hear Mr. Elmer make a statement that somehow it runs counter to the Resilient Act of 2014, and it's not meeting the goals that was sought to be achieved. Although they were, I forgot the exact phrase that he used, but I think what he said is those were goals, but they were not mandates. Where does this project fall in terms of the health risks, the environmental risks to the people of Burrillville?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
That's a great question. So, the way this project fits into the Resilient Rhode Island Act and the goal to do two things. Number one, reduce carbon emissions. Reduce carbon emissions in our region, in our state, in our region. Number two, get more renewable energy on the grid. More wind, more solar. As Richard said, everybody wants that. Invenergy wants that. That's their core business. So this project supports both of those goals, and those are primary goals that support the Resilient Rhode Island Act. Here's how it does it. This project, because it's the cleanest, most efficient project of its kind, and because of the rules that I just described, the priority rules that the ISO New England will go to when power is needed. If there's a coal or oil burning facility in Connecticut, 50 miles away, 30 miles away from Rhode Island, for example, that is ready, willing, and able to provide that service, that power. But it burns dirtier, it burns coal, it burns oil. If this project is available, this project will be selected. When this project provides that same amount of power, that kilowatt power that's needed, it will displace, it will block the production of oil and coal power from, say, an older, less efficient, dirtier project nearby. Now, we all know that atmospherics being what they are, the production of emissions in, say, Connecticut 30, 40 miles away from here is going to come into Rhode Island. So this project, when it displaces that dirtier project, we will have less carbon emissions in Rhode Island and in our region. That's number one. Number two, we've already described that the goal of the Resilient Rhode Island Act is to set that overall economy-wide target to reduce emissions, to help climate change, reduce emissions. You can do that by building more renewable energy projects. And because we just described, you need to have backstop capability to support the renewables. Renewables can't do it all you can't just build 100% renewables today. The ISO New England projected documents, their forecast documents, recognize this. As a goal, they say we need more renewables, we need to get there, and the way we get there is to make sure we have the most efficient backstop power available so we can do this together.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we take that argument for a minute, that this clean power, when it's up and running, would be the offset, for lack of a better way of saying it, in the alternative for other sources that wouldn't be as clean, should there be a need. And we juxtapose that argument with what I asked Mr. Elmer earlier about ratepayer savings. Mr. Elmer talked about the sale of these at these auctions, at these capacity auctions on these futures, and he said that, for the past 2 years, there really wasn't there was a gain, it really wasn't an issue, but now he says up till February of next year that it's not true that we would have any gain in our rate savings. The plant's not built yet. Are you in a position to be able to say whether or not that would remain true after the plant was built?
No, I mean, our understanding is, an expectation is that when this plant is built, ratepayer savings will accrue. That is, rates will go down once this project is operating. And it will do that because the portion of your bill that says energy on it is a factor, a feature of what it costs to produce that energy. This being a very efficient, highly efficient project, it can produce more power more efficiently, less costly than from, say, an older facility that needed a lot of maintenance and a lot of upgrading, was slower. So pound for pound, kilowatt for kilowatt, this project produces power less expensively, cheaper. That savings flows down to the customers. So I think that would kick in, Senator, at the time the project is actually operating. You know, once it's constructed and operating.
So then to follow that, may I? Chairman? So to follow that thought here on page 3, Mr. Elmer said that the presence or absence of Invenergy, the Invenergy plant will have only a small impact on ratepayers. And it stands to reason the presence of Invenergy plant's power was going to help you save money for ratepayers, then the ISO would have taken all of Invenergy's 900 to 1,000 megawatts. And he's talking about on those auctions. The reason that the ISO wasn't even interested in buying all this money's generation capacity is that Invenergy's capacity just wasn't going to bring down the capacity clearing price in any significant way. That price was already as low as it could be. How do you respond to that?
Well, this gets into economics and analysis. I mean, this is very
I don't
technical.
expect something really spot on, just a response.
Yeah, my response is I don't agree with Jerry at all with his. I don't agree at all with his notion that constructing a plant this efficient is going to have what he calls net zero ratepayer savings. Our expert analysis that we produced to the Public Utilities Commission indicates there'll be over $200 million in ratepayer savings in 3 years alone, in 3 years, once operating. And that, by the way, we're going to get an answer on that question from the Public Utilities Commission in just a matter of a few months, because they are obligated to provide an advisory opinion to the EFSB on how much ratepayer savings this project is going to bring. And there's a lot of experts looking into that, and they're not our experts, and they're not Jerry Elmer's experts. They're the Public Utilities Commission.
Senator Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on that discussion a little more, if I could, because as you just pointed out to us, there is a process in place statutorily in Rhode Island right now that must be working, because this legislation doesn't address that process that we have spent so much time talking about this afternoon and early this evening, correct?
Correct.
In other words, as you just pointed out, and CLF is engaged in both forums that will ultimately answer those questions for the people of the state of Rhode Island.
Absolutely. Being
that the PUC, the issue on the need, as you said, that's being addressed by the PUC, as Jerry explained to us, will ultimately end up in an advisory as part of that process before the Energy Facility Siting Board. And while you both will advocate from your respective positions, which are essentially not diametrically opposed, but pretty close to it at this point, the people, unlike us, the people who have the expertise in that, the Public Utilities Commission, their experts will actually support the Public Utilities Commission in making that decision, correct?
That's correct, Senator Conley. They are independent experts. They will determine who's right. They will hear both sides, and they will make a decision and advise.
And the PUC uses its own experts to do that. Respectfully, it doesn't rely on yours, and it doesn't rely on Jerry's.
I would like them to rely on mine, Senator Conley, but they will look to energy experts, people who spend their whole life just digging into forecasts, economics, market issues like that.
And then once it goes to the EFSB, the Energy Facility Siting Board, it is that board who currently, as not to repeat it all, currently has those resources that we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, who has a charge under the statute as to the criteria they are to evaluate, the charge to make specific findings will ultimately make the determination on the siting of the plant.
That's right, Senator Connolly. And among those charges, if you haven't heard this already, is the project needed in this region to supply the energy that's required? And will there be ratepayer cost savings? What will be the economic impact of this project? Those are two of the charges, right square on the EFSB.
And when we look at the bill that's before us today, would you agree that, in essence, this bill has two principal components to it? It provides for a reconstitution of the membership of the EFSB. Would you agree with that?
Agree. I think that's part of the legislation.
And to which Mr. Elba said, don't worry about that part of it, just take it right out. Recall that part of the testimony?
I think I remember.
I believe that Mr.
Mr. Beretta was here.
Your choice of words, Senator Conley, about Constitution is, I think, probably what his concerns are because of the due process and equal protection issues that arise from changing the game halfway through the game.
Right, but it was right before the bell rang, so it was at the bell. But at the conclusion of his testimony, he actually said to us, as the advocate for his position, take that, if you're worried about that part of it, just take it out. Because the other part of this bill is the tax treaty component and the requirement of a referendum for the tax treaty. So the heart and soul of the bill are the makeup of the EFSB and a local referendum for a tax treaty for the plant. It doesn't suggest that anything is wrong with the process on citing the plant. It doesn't suggest that any of the criteria that the plant uses under that the EFSB uses under the statute to cite it is wrong. It doesn't suggest that any of the process that the EFSB uses is wrong. So while it's very interesting to hear you discuss those issues, it's really collateral to what this statute is about and what we're supposed to consider in regard to it.
If Mr. Elmer had not introduced those topics,
I didn't mean that in a chastising way at all. I just meant to say that while I understand how critical those issues are and how important they are to the people in this room and why they should be, there is a forum designed and working and doing its job to answer those questions, to make findings of fact based on a pretty in-depth, fairly long process before two separate jurisdictions, the Public Utilities Commission and the EFSB, that work in concert with one another to answer those questions. And so I'm just suggesting that while those are very important, they're critical to the state of Rhode Island, they're critical to the people in the town of Burrillville, they have nothing to do with this bill.
Lombardi.
Thank you. If you don't mind, can you just dummy down for us a little bit how your plant will increase renewable energy for the state of Rhode Island?
Yeah, the simple answer is it will increase renewable energy because it will provide the backstop capability to supply the power that's needed it's the support mechanism for renewables. If renewables cannot work, perform, right? Because the wind is not blowing, or it's nighttime. There's no sun. So solar energy is not much help at night, and wind energy is very little help, if at all, on a day with no wind. So in that situation, you need backstop power. Something has to supply the energy. Something has to do it. You can't just say, well, we won't have electricity until the wind comes back or the sun is shining. So that's the backstop. And if you're going to have a backstop, make it the most efficient, cleanest burning backstop you could possibly get. And that's how it supports renewables. This project is in place. Keep bringing the renewables. Keep bringing them. And when the renewables come online, this is an important point. When the renewables come online, the ISO New England will always go to the renewables first if they are available. And this project will not run if renewables can supply the resource that's needed. That's an important point.
Are there any other questions or comments?
If I could just make one more comment. Senator Conley raised the issue of this bill having two elements. And we obviously are opposed to the second element, the referendum element. I mean, Senator Lombardi, Senator Conley, Senator Archambault, Senator Nesselbush, I think to a degree Senator Jabor as well, have made the arguments that, that we feel that we're being subjected to something that is unprecedented in Rhode Island, that the more global arguments have been made by everyone else in terms of the chilling effect that it would have. The effect on my client is dramatic. A tax treaty was just negotiated in January, for example, in Burrillville. There was no referendum associated with that, and I understand that laws change. But this, in many ways, is almost a bill of attainder, and that's an old law school entity. But this is a bill directed at a certain special entity for the reason to do the project some harm. And again, there's all kinds of due process, equal protection. Bill of attainder is maybe a kind of a reach, but the reality is that again, it's changing the rules in the middle of the game, and was not part of anyone's calculus in terms of making the economic decision to invest almost $750 million, $700 million plus in Rhode Island to create 300 construction jobs for more than 2 years. The labor element on this project alone is $150 million in salaries and benefits for the men and women that will build this facility. Again, we've discussed the fact that there's a significant tax treaty that's near completion with the town. This is a significant economic driver, and to in any way alter that calculus is patently unfair, and again, we oppose that as much, if not more vigorously, than the restructuring of the EFSB.